people that are just doing amazing things. And on that note, this week we have a really special guest. So I'm really excited to hear what he has to say because he's an information historian, collector of great stories. And I don't know if that was a proper sentence, but whatever. That's a Carrie sentence. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about our special guest today, and I know you will enjoy all. He's been telling me so many great stories, so I'll have him repeat some, or I'll ask him to. So our guest this week is Bill Haltom. He is an award-winning newspaper and magazine columnist and author. He is a columnist for the Tennessee USA Today Network and the author of 8 books, ranging in topics from seersucker. Yes, seersucker, you heard it here. And I'm gonna ask him a few questions about that later on, to civility. Now that's a big range, I might add, but I have to say, anybody who wears seersucker is already somewhat civilized in my opinion, fashionably speaking. And then again, my English remains to have some corrections here. Okay, his latest book, Why Can't Mother Vote? Joseph Hanover and the Unfinished Business of Democracy, tells the story of an unsung hero of the successful passage of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, 100 years ago this summer. Joseph Hanover, an Orthodox Jew, both born in Haltom, Poland in 1889, I hope I pronounced that correctly, came to America when he was just 5 years old. His parents helped young Joe and his brothers escape the oppression of the Tsar and the pogroms. They ended up in Memphis, where Joe grew up working in the family dry goods store and eventually attending night law school and becoming a lawyer. He was elected to the Tennessee legislature in 1918, and in the summer of 1920 led the successful fight for ratification of the 19th Amendment. Bill's book is more than the history of a great man who helped win the vote for his mother and all American women. It is a book about the unfinished business of democracy, a fight still going on today. And yes, I would say that is very true. And so, without further ado, I'm just going to hand it right over to Bill because he's got a lot to share with us. So enjoy, and if you have any questions, please type them into the YouTube channel that you're watching, and I will see them and be able to ask Bill any of your questions. So let's have a conversation. Take it away, Bill.
Well, thank you, Carrie. I love telling stories and sharing stories, and over the years, I've written 8 books sharing stories. Everybody from Pat Summitt's early Title IX battles for full court basketball for women, to Senator Howard Baker's Civility, which has gone out of style. I wrote a book called The Other Fellow May Be Right, The Civility of Senator Howard Baker, to the quintessential work on seersucker, Carrie. I know you're a fashion designer, but I wrote the book called Milk and Sugar, The Complete Book of Seersucker, which I think has a lot to do with civility, because it's hard not to be civil when you're in a seersucker outfit. And my latest book, Why Can't Mother Vote? Joseph Hanover and the Unfinished Business of Democracy, is another story about someone who inspires me. Now, I love to share these stories, but I'm gonna tell you this. I'm particularly happy today to share Joe Hanover's story with the Gordon JCC group, and I'll tell you why. The reason is this group has a real connection to Joe Hanover, a very deep and abiding connection to Joe Hanover. First of all, you have a geographic and physical connection to Joe Hanover, because so much of the story of Joe Hanover's fight for women's suffrage 100 years ago took place in Nashville, Tennessee, at 2 very special places you all know well: the Hermitage Hotel, the beautiful lobby where the War of the Roses was fought between the yellow rose wearing suffragists and the red rose wearing opponents of suffrage. So you have that proximity. Second, all of you in the Gordon JCC have a spiritual and faith connection to Joe Hanover's story, because there's a chapter in the book that Gene Roseman, your wonderful historian, helped give me the information on, called The Battle of Women of Faith, because Jewish women in Nashville helped lead the fight dramatically that summer. Women's suffrage would not have passed in Tennessee, and therefore passed in the nation, without the battle of some heroes in the Jewish faith community of Jewish women And of course, Joe Hanover himself was an Orthodox Jew, and I'll talk about him more in just a moment, from Pawtusk, Poland, who came to America, never took democracy for granted, fought for it his entire life for the principles of his new nation. And then third, as Carrie mentioned, there's the legacy. You know, we are remembering this week the remarkable life of Congressman John Lewis. And John Lewis's fight for civil rights started in Nashville, Tennessee. He came here when he was 17 years old to attend the American Baptist College and began to, from his church connections and group connections, and started his civil rights battle with the sit-ins at the lunch counters in Nashville. And of course, the great John Siegenthaler, the late great editor of the Tennessean, Bobby Kennedy's top assistant at the Justice Department when Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General of the United States, and a man who rode with John Lewis on the Freedom Rides. And so this story of an early fighter for civil rights in this country, of Joe Hanover, is a story that has a long history in Nashville. And it's a story that, as Carrie said, and I'll end on today, is a battle that is still continuing today. You know, my book is, I hope, more than just a history of a great man, more than just a history of a movement. I hope it's a book highly relevant to 2020 and the battles that still remain to be fought in, as Carrie mentioned, the sort of subtitle of my book, The Unfinished Business of Democracy. I want to start my sharing the story of Joe Hanover with you by just reading from the prologue of the book. And I will tell you that I'm not going to read you much more than the prologue because I want you to buy a copy of the book. So if I read it all to you, I want you to buy a copy of the book. No, seriously. This prologue starts on a remarkable day in Nashville. And that date was, it's coming up on 100 years anniversary that date, August 18th, 1920. And it started in the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel. 30-year-old State Representative Joseph Hanover walked through the grand lobby of the elegant hotel to be greeted by deafening cheers and jeers. The cheers came from a multitude of women in white dresses adorned with yellow roses, the symbol of their support for the proposed 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, granting women the right to vote. The jeers came from scores of other women, also wearing roses, but their roses were red, the symbol of the opposition to women's suffrage. There were men in the crowd as well, some donning yellow roses, some donning red roses on their seersucker suits. And there were a few politicians in the crowd who was trying to straddle the floral fence, wearing both yellow and red roses pinned to their lapels. And the national media called this battle in Nashville that day the War of the Roses. Walking alongside young Joe Hanover was a tall, handsome Nashville police officer, Captain Paul Bush. Governor A.H. Roberts had assigned Captain Bush to be Joe Hanover's bodyguard. And Joe Hanover said he didn't want him, but he needed him. Because you see, in the days leading up to this vote on whether the state of Tennessee would become the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution and finally deliver women the right to vote, Joe Hanover had been physically assaulted in the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel. He'd been physically assaulted in the elevator of the Hermitage Hotel, his assailant calling him a Bolshevik and using other anti-Semitic terrible phrases. Both the adoration and the hatred of Joe Hanover that emerged that day in the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel was for the same reason. Joe Hanover, this Orthodox Jew from Pawtusk, Poland, had become the nation's leading male voice in the fight for women's suffrage. For more than 70 years, American women had fought for the most important right of any citizen of the United States, the right to vote. The founding fathers had granted that right in the Constitution, but for the first 130 years of our republic, voting had been the exclusive right of men, and for the most part, frankly, white men. Beginning with a meeting in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, generations of women had petitioned, marched, and vigorously lobbied for the political emancipation of half the nation, only to be scorned, humiliated, and in some cases, even imprisoned. With the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, granting all citizens the equal protection of the law, many thought the campaign for women's suffrage had been won. But in 1875, the United States Supreme Court unanimously ruled in the case of Minor versus Hepperset that the 14th Amendment did not apply to women, did not grant them the right to vote. In 1878, Senator Aaron Seacrest of California introduced in the United States Senate the Anthony Amendment, named in honor of the great suffragist Susan B. Anthony, seeking a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. The proposed amendment languished in a Senate committee for 9 years until the Senate rejected it in 1887 by a vote of 16 to 34. The battle for women's suffrage continued for the next 3 decades, with some incremental gains as a few states passed legislation enacting either full or partial suffrage for women. In 1914, a constitutional amendment to grant women the right to vote was proposed again, and the Senate was rejected again. But in 1918, the movement gained momentum when President Woodrow Wilson spoke in favor of it in his State of the Union address. On May 21st, 1919, with yet another proposed 19th Amendment before them, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution approving the Anthony Amendment. 2 weeks later, on June 4th, 1919, the Senate finally passed the proposed amendment by a vote of 56 to 20. And then began a journey that had lasted over a year. Because you see, it took 36 states, 3/4 of the states then, to ratify the 19th Amendment, to make it the law of the land. Initially, support for ratification lined up very quickly, with 5 states passing ratification within a week of the amendment was submitted by Congress. 9 more states joined in ratification in the summer and fall of 1919. By the spring of 1920, 35 states, just 1 state short, had approved the proposed amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And then the process bogged down. 7 southern states, one by one, all rejected the amendment. There was even talk in Ohio, one of the first states to pass the 19th Amendment ratification. There was talk of reconvening the legislature to reconsider the matter. In the summer of 1920, it came down to 2 states, Delaware and our own Tennessee. In June of 1920, Delaware rejected it. And it all came down that summer. In August of 1920, 100 years ago, to the volunteer state. And it wasn't just a question of whether it was going to be passed if we rejected it. The states had more or less lined up. States were reconsidering around the country. It literally came down to the volunteer state. On August 7th, 1920, Governor Roberts issued a proclamation calling for the 61st Tennessee General Assembly into extraordinary session to come to the state capitol to debate and vote on the ratification of the amendment. On August 8th, 30-year-old Joe Hanover took a train from his hometown of Memphis, made the 220-mile trip to Nashville's Union Station, and checked in to the Hermitage Hotel. The Hermitage Hotel was packed. It wasn't just packed with legislators. It was packed with yellow rose wearing suffragists. It was packed with the antis. It was packed with lobbyists, reporters, bootleggers, and preachers. I'm going to say that again. It was packed with bootleggers and preachers. Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, with 2 million members nationwide, had a suite on the 3rd floor, a command post to secure the passage of the legislation. In rooms alongside the hotel mezzanine, Josephine Anderson Pearson of Monteagle, Tennessee, the president of the Tennessee Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, marshaled the resistance. U.S. Senator Kenneth McKellar came down from Washington to lobby for the passage of the amendment. The venerable lobby of the Hermitage Hotel became known as the 3rd house of the Tennessee legislature. There was the House of Representatives, there was the Tennessee Senate, and there was the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel. Initially, it appeared the extraordinary session was going to be a very short one. The state Senate quickly passed the resolution by ratification by a vote of 25 to 4 after only 3 hours of debate. Passage in the House also seemed a foregone conclusion, as 62 of the 99 members prior to the session had executed written pledges of support for ratification. And then it all began to unravel. And the unraveling started with a man named Seth Walker, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives. Speaker Seth Walker of Lebanon reversed his position, became a fiery opponent of the amendment, and frankly, he played the race card. He said, this is a white man's country. And if we give the vote to women, it's going to be the Negroes that are going to want to vote next. Lobbyists came to Nashville, powerful lobbyists from the L&N Railroad, which for some reason was opposed to women's suffrage. There was even opposition by Jack Daniels. Yes, Jack Daniels. The Jack Daniels liquor industry opened, even though prohibition was existing at the time, opened what was known as the Jack Daniels Suite on the 7th floor, where legislators went to relax, discuss, and ply themselves with liquor. And there was this weird, unholy alliance between Jack Daniels and the Women's Christian Temperance Union with the support of Josephine Pearson from Mont Eagle, Tennessee, my second hometown. Josephine Pearson joined forces with Jack Daniels and the preachers to oppose this. And there were courageous women of faith from Nashville, who many of the Jewish faith, who had fought for this battle for years and years. The 62 pledged votes for it fell to 55. And then with the lobbyists coming and the money changing hands and the liquor changing hands, it fell to 47. And at this point, Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, called young Joe Hanover into her suite on the 3rd floor. And she asked him a question, and he never expected this. She said, "Will you take over the fight? Will you lead the fight in the Tennessee House for the passage of this?" Now, he was an unlikely choice. Number one, he was the only immigrant in the Tennessee legislature, although, as I say in the book, we were all immigrants unless you're Native Americans. But he was the only member of the Tennessee legislature who had not been born in the United States of America. He was the only Jewish member of the Tennessee legislature. He was the only independent in the legislature, not a Republican, not a Democrat, had been elected as an independent out of Memphis, in Boss Crump's hometown, where you almost had to be a Democrat of his choice to be selected to hold public office. But Carrie Chapman Catt knew two things about Joe Hanover that were very important. One, she knew he was a fiery proponent for women's suffrage, that from the day he had arrived at the legislature, he had fought for this. And number two, she knew something else about Joe Hanover. She knew that Joe Hanover had enormous respect in the legislature. You see, he was one of the few lawyers in the legislature. He befriended people on both sides of the aisle. And most of the legislators were rural legislators at that time, not without a lot of legal skills or drafting. And the word got around the Tennessee General Assembly that if you want a bill written, go talk to Joe Hanover from Memphis. He will write it up for you. Carrie Chapman Catt realized this, and she asked Joe Hanover to lead the fight. Joe Hanover was facing the most powerful forces in Tennessee politics: the Speaker of the House, the L&N Railroad, Jack Daniels, preachers. But Joe took over this fight. And on that morning of August 18th, 1920, to the cheers and jeers of the crowd, he walked out of the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel, took a left turn, and walked to the Capitol to lead the final fight that day. It was a journey for him that had actually begun many years earlier. It's a journey that began in Pawtusk, Poland in 1889, when he was born the third son of Esther and Wolf Hanover. It's a story about his earliest memory of a journey to America, crossing a frozen lake in Poland in the winter of 1895. You see, Wolf Hanover's father wanted to get the Hanover family out of the oppression in Poland. The Tsar had confiscated all their property. They were being persecuted, and Wolf Hanover was determined to find a new home for his family. A couple of years before 1895, Wolf Hanover actually left his wife, Esther, and their three sons there in Pawtusk, and he made a journey to find a new home. He went from Pawtusk to London, to New York City, to St. Louis, and eventually to Memphis, Tennessee. He came to Memphis because he had a cousin there who was also originally from Poland, who had made that journey. Wolf Hanover worked as a cobbler, a tailor, and eventually found himself in Memphis, Tennessee, in the Pinch District of Memphis, where there were so many Jewish immigrants at that time, building a new life there. And there he opened a dry goods store and began to send money, get money back to his wife, Esther, to support them at that time and to get them a journey. He finally, in 1895, found them steamship tickets to America. But it still wasn't so simple as showing up on a port in Poland. He sent his wife, Esther, $500. And that $500 was in part to pay a bootlegger to help them escape the oppression in Poland. And young Joe Hanover's one of his earliest memories of life in his life was of darkness and cold, because you see, in the winter of 1895, Joe Hanover was placed in a knapsack on the back of one of those bootleggers who walked across that frozen lake. Esther, Joe's mother, behind him, holding the hands of her two other sons. Esther had a wig on top of her head, and in the wig was the money that her husband had sent. And in her hosiery under her dress was a piece of salami, which she was going to use to feed her sons on that journey. They got on that steamship and they started to make the journey. And that led to one of Joe Hanover's second memories. This is a good one, actually. They were down in the steerage. Most of the time, Esther was sick. They were just having great difficulty. And then 5-year-old rather, Joe Hanover, one night made his way up to the top of the deck, where there were not people in steerage. There were people having a party with an orchestra. And young Joe Hanover got up on the stage and began to dance and to entertain the crowd. And the crowd responded by throwing him money. And he took his cap off and collected that money and gave it to his mother. And when they made that journey all the way to Ellis Island and had to buy train tickets when they got through Ellis Island to get to Memphis, Tennessee, to meet his father there, that money came in handy, because that $500 that had been raised was pretty much gone. Joe Hanover and his brothers and his mother and father found a place in a little community called Binghamton. Binghamton was outside the city of Memphis at that time, just to the east of Memphis. Binghamton to this day is now part of Memphis. And there on Broad Avenue in Binghamton, the Hanovers, Wolf Hanover, opened a dry goods store called W.C. Hanover and Sons. Joe was one of the sons. And over the next several years, Joe and his brother, they lived on the second floor of the building there. W.C. Hanover and Sons was on the first floor. They were on the second floor. And over the years there, when Joe was just barely old enough to read, his mother and father said, "We want you and your brothers to do something. We're living in the greatest country on the face of the earth. We can worship where we please, as we please. We are free to work. No one is going to confiscate our property. And you boys need to read the American documents. You need to read the Constitution of the United States. You need to read the Bill of Rights. You need to read what this country is all about." Young Joe Hanover on the second floor of W.C. Hanover and Sons on Broad Avenue in Binghamton, Tennessee, by a kerosene lamp, read those documents. And one night, he asked his parents a question. He said, "But why can't mother vote?" Joe Hanover reflected later in life that his parents just said, "Well, that's just the way it is here now." They didn't have much of an explanation about this. But Joe realized something as a young man. He didn't take democracy for granted. He realized that democracy was and still is a work in progress. And he wanted to be a part of that progress. He wanted to make what's in the Bill of Rights. He wanted to make those rights available to all Americans, including his mother. So he worked at W.C. Hanover by day. At night, he studied and read those documents. He only had an education through the 8th grade, a formal education, because, in those days, a working class kid had to work. So after the 8th grade, he just worked full time. And then he began to go to night law school. He went to night law school at the old Southern Law School, which eventually became the University of Memphis Law School. In 1914, he passed the bar and became a lawyer. And then he began to work on the unfinished business of democracy. In 1918, he ran as an independent for the Tennessee legislature. And again, as I said, if you know the history of Memphis, you know the history of Boss Crump, who controlled not only Memphis politics, but pretty much the politics of the state for a long time. But he ran as an independent and somehow got elected. He only served one term, and they tried to kick him out of office during that one term from 1918 to 1920, because while he was in the legislature, he got a nice job as an assistant city attorney for the city of Memphis. And all of a sudden, Boss Crump and the other people that weren't real happy about having independent Joe Hanover in the Tennessee legislature cited a constitutional provision that you couldn't hold the Tennessee legislature and another government job and they challenged him. Joe just chose to ignore the challenge. And he was not going to even worry about running for another term in the legislature because he had this nice job. And then in August of 1920, Joe Hanover heard the word, and actually in the summer of 1920, that there might be another session of that legislature. He had been in the first session. The legislature only met every other year in those days. So he'd been at the 1919 session, wasn't even really planning to return in 1921. But that summer, he heard about that battle, that special session, and he wanted to commit that promise to his mother. Why can't mother vote? And so he had to run, believe it or not, in a special election because the Attorney General of Tennessee declared his position in the legislature to be vacant because of his position with the city attorneys as an assistant city attorney. So Joe Hanover then filed to run for his seat again after stepping down briefly from the city attorney's office, and he got elected. And in August of 1920, he came to the Tennessee legislature to help lead that fight. Now, let me just tell you a few things about the end of the story, because there's no, spoiler alert, the 19th Amendment did pass. But seriously, it was an incredible battle. On August 17th, 1920, with the galleries packed with yellow rose wearing women, red rose wearing women, lobbyists, reporters from across the country. On that date, there was a final debate. And that final debate, Seth Walker, the Speaker of the Tennessee House of Representatives, handed the gavel over to the Speaker pro tem, and he made his way down to the podium so he could speak from the well of the House and speak against the 19th Amendment. And he played the race card. He read a telegram from the, quote, colored women of colored voters, women of Los Angeles, urging Tennessee to pass this so that they could vote. So that women, not only just women, but Black women across the country could vote. He held this telegram up and said, this is outrageous. This is a white man's country. He played the race card. Joe Hanover gave the opposition speech that day. And Joe Hanover told the legislature, reminded them of the story of his journey from Pawtusk, Poland. He told the story of his journey of going across the frozen lake in Poland. And then he looked at his fellow legislators and said, I want to remind you, all of us here crossed the seas to get here. And that was his final speech. The next day, the legislature was packed. Speaker Walker said, we're gonna press this vote right now. And they were 2 votes short. They were 2 votes short. Seth Walker knew he had the votes. They were 2 votes short in getting the 50 votes they were going to need to pass the 19th Amendment and give women the right to vote. But that day, 3 heroes emerged. Some of them, my friend Tyler Boyd, who wrote a biography of one of them, his uncle, Harry Byrne, calls them the suffragettes. The suffragettes emerged that day. I called them the suffragist brothers. 3 men that day. One, everybody knew was going to be for the 19th Amendment. That was Joe Hanover. The other 2 was Banks Turner from Yorkville, Tennessee, and Harry Byrne. What happened that day was there were a couple of votes that day. There was a vote to first to table it. Just to table it means, of course, y'all probably know parliamentary procedure as well as I do. That's just to say we're just going to stop this right now. We're going to shelf this thing. And Seth Walker wanted to table it to kill it. He wanted to table it to kill it and thought he had the votes to table it and kill it. And he didn't intend for this vote to come back up. He wanted to stop it. He wanted to stop it that day. And when the vote took place on the motion to table, everybody seemed to be voting right along the line until they came to the name of Banks Turner. And Banks Turner, who was known as an opponent of women's suffrage at that time, was thought to be a secure vote against women's suffrage. He voted against the motion to table, which resulted in that motion not passing because it was a tie vote, 49 votes to table. Speaker Walker was convinced that Banks Turner had just gotten confused. That's the only thing that happened. He just got confused. Speaker Walker walked to Banks Turner's desk on the floor of the legislature, put his hand on his shoulder, and asked for another vote. Asked for another vote on the motion to table. And the call came again. Speaker Walker is literally looking at Banks Turner, glaring at him, convinced that he's going to vote to table. And Banks Turner once again voted against the motion to table. The motion to table had failed. Now, one thing people didn't know about Banks Turner was that earlier that same day, the governor of Tennessee, Governor Roberts, had summoned him into his office. And he summoned him into his office in the governor's mansion to be a part of a phone call with the Democratic nominee for president of the United States that year, the governor of Ohio, because he wanted to, the governor of Ohio wanted to make sure, he thought that it would help him get elected president of the United States that fall if they would just get the women's vote around the country. And what happened during that phone conversation that day was that Governor Roberts, talking to Governor James Cox of Ohio, the Democratic nominee for president, Governor Cox was pleading with Governor Roberts to make sure the legislature passed it. And Governor Roberts said, looking directly at Banks Turner in the governor's office, said, "The man who I think will help it pass today is sitting directly across from me," referring to Banks Turner. Banks Turner left the governor's mansion that day, governor's office that day in the Capitol, convinced to vote for women's suffrage, but he didn't tell anybody. He didn't tell Seth Walker. So when that vote came and he did not vote to table, it was pretty shocking. But you know, Seth Walker still had the votes. He still had the votes. They had to have two more votes to pass women's suffrage. And Seth Walker knew it was going to fail by one vote. And so he said, quote, "The hour has come. It's time for the vote." And they began to call the roll call again. And people began to vote. And at that point, the third suffragette, the third brother to the suffragist, a man named Harry Byrne, who was wearing a red rose that day, was thought to be a vote against women's suffrage. When Harry Byrne's name was called, he voted for women's suffrage. He voted for the enactment of the 19th Amendment. Seth Walker was still convinced there was just confusion. Banks Turner supported it. Harry Byrne must have been confused. And asked for another vote, and it passed 49-48. At that point, a very frustrated Seth Walker decided to make one more parliamentary move. He moved to change his vote to support. You know why? If you know parliamentary procedure again, if you're going to have a motion to reconsider, you have to be part of the majority that voted for it to have a motion to reconsider. So Seth Walker changed his vote, not realizing, though, that he'd made a mistake. You see, that gave the 19th Amendment 50 votes in the House, not 49, a clear majority. It was discovered later that day, or not long thereafter, that yes, Harry Byrne that day had been wearing a red rose, the symbol of an opposition to suffrage. He had told suffrage supporters, "You don't have to worry about me in the end." But Seth Walker didn't know that. People weren't really aware of that. What people did not know was on that day, Harry Byrne had a note in his coat pocket. And the note was from his mother. And the note from his wonderful mother said for him to support Carrie, to support women's suffrage. And Harry Byrne was a good boy. He did what his mother asked him to do. That day, the Tennessee House of Representatives passed the 19th Amendment, ratifying the night, becoming the 36th state. Now, the fight wasn't totally over. Seth Walker tried to fight it for days. The following day, the opponents took what they call the Red Rose Express. They actually fled Tennessee and went to Decatur, Alabama, trying to, I don't know what I thought they were going to do. They're going to thwart any final action on this, although it had passed. But it didn't work. And they actually accused the forces against suffrage accused both Joe Hanover and Harry Byrne of a bribery. Actually got a statement transcribed by some witness to this alleged bribery for his vote. But the problem is the woman they asked to transcribe this statement was a supporter of women's suffrage. And she wrote down what they told her to write down. And then she told the newspapers it was a lie. And so that effort failed. A few weeks later, the Secretary of State signed into law the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Joe Hanover went back to Memphis. He never returned to the Tennessee legislature. He had a remarkable career as a lawyer. He was at one time appointed the Attorney General of Shelby County, and Boss Crump was so angry about it that Boss Crump, when Joe went over to be sworn in, Boss Crump had instructed all the judges in Shelby County to not swear him in. Don't do it. We're not going to let him be the Attorney General. Joe Hanover then took a train to Nashville, found somebody, a judge to swear him in, went back. Boss Crump had locked up the Attorney General's office. All the assistant AGs had resigned, and he had dismissed the grand jury. So Joe Hanover had no business to really conduct, and he left office shortly after. But he had a remarkable legal career during that time, and including a remarkable career of helping members of his own family and other displaced people come to America after World War II. It was an incredible story. But let me end my story about him with this, and that's his legacy of where we are today. Joe Hanover is soon returning to Memphis. He is going to be a part of the statuary in downtown Memphis. You know, you can go to Centennial Park now and here and see the statuary of some of the great suffragists. You can go to Knoxville and see Harry Byrne statue. You can see Sue Shelton White. You can see all these statuaries of these great figures. And this fall, thanks to the outstanding work of Paula Casey and other modern 21st century suffragists, the sculptures will be unveiled, and Joe Hanover will be facing the river he loved in Memphis behind his law school alma mater, the University of Memphis. I hope that when you come there to see him, or when you see the other suffragist statuary in Nashville and Knoxville and Chattanooga and the other places around the state where they're being erected in this 100th anniversary, I'll hope you'll remember what I think Joe Hanover would tell us if he were here with us today. You see, late in life, he was asked in an interview, what was the answer to the question, why couldn't mother vote? What was the answer that you didn't get initially when you were a young boy in Binghamton, when you asked your parents that question? And Joe Hanover's response was, I came to realize that democracy is a work in progress, and there was still work to be done. And today, as we remember Joe Hanover, as we remember John Lewis, as we remember the many voices in Nashville over the years and the Jewish women of faith that fought for this, we can remind ourselves once more that there's unfinished business. There's unfinished business, and we need to take care and address that business. Thank you for letting me share the story of Joe Hanover.
Wow. I have to say that there was no way I was going to interrupt you at any point. That was riveting. And so much, I have to say, unfortunately, I didn't even realize all the history of this, in this story and how it came about. And so thank you so much for that. If there's anybody out there who has any questions, please type them into YouTube and we can ask Bill. We can wait a few minutes. Meantime, I actually had a question because you're a writer and a creative person, and I'm interested actually, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, Carrie, I really appreciate that question. Interestingly enough, it was not my idea. The last book I wrote, which is a book called Full Court Press, How Pat Summitt and a high school basketball player and a legal team changed the game, was the book I did a couple of years ago with a wonderful co-author named Amanda Swanson. And that is the story. People all know about Pat winning over 1,000 games and 8 national championships. What a lot of people don't realize is that when Pat started playing basketball, she wasn't even allowed to play full court. that girls basketball in Tennessee and in most of the country was a half court game because it was considered dangerous, Carrie, for you or my wife to run the full court. And early on in her coaching career, there was a Title IX lawsuit that Victoria Cape, a wonderful young high school basketball player in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, who wanted to run the full court, filed a Title IX lawsuit. And at trial, her lawyers called young Pat Summitt as their expert witness. It was incredible. And so I wrote this book about what I call one of Pat's greatest victories, not on a basketball court, but in the courtroom, opening up the full court for players. And I was having a signing of the book at a novel bookstore in Memphis. And my friends Paula Casey and Jossie Wurzburg, who I hope are watching today, both from Memphis, both real leaders of the women's trailblazers of the group across the state. To Paula's one of the people who helped put out the beautiful book Perfect 36, which I recommend you read, the great story of this. And they came up to me. I was very flattered by this. It's kind of funny. They came up to me at the signing and they said, "We know what your next book is going to be." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. Please tell me, because I have no idea." And they said, "Well, you need to write the story of Joe Hanover. Somebody needs to write because he's the unsung hero. People do know Harry Burns' great story, and that is a great story. And Tyler Boyd, my friend, has written a wonderful book about his uncle, Harry Burns, which is worth reading. But people hadn't written about Joe Hanover. And I began to research the story, and I said, this really is a great story. I like the fact, Carrie, that he was an immigrant. I like the fact that he didn't take democracy for granted. I think it's just such a compelling story. And anyway, so that's why I chose to write. And one of the great things when you write a biography, and I would recommend this to you, when you write a biography, you get to know someone. And sometimes you write a biography of somebody who's still alive. And I wrote one about Senator Howard Baker, and you got to spend time with him. That was great. I never met Joe Hanover. He's been gone for close to a half century. And I began to call him Uncle Joe when I talked to Eddie Kaplan, his nephew in Memphis, who provided so much of this to me and other family members. He became a friend. He became Uncle Joe. I felt like I really got to know him. So that was a real joy. But that's the reason I wrote the book.
As I was listening to you speak, I was reminded, how people anybody really, but people's personal story and, leads them into places they may never even realize that they're leading them into. So as, when you were telling the story of him crossing the lake with his family, and it was so visual, it reminded me of why people are inspired, by these forces of like fate in a way, where they are at a certain time in life and who they are as people combined together. And it becomes this like unfolding of a path that somebody might not even know they were destined for. Mm-hmm. And like, for example, just recently, a good friend of mine fought for the last 5 years in Nashville legislation to get the home studios passed so musicians could work from their home, but it extended beyond that to people can work from their home legally where they could not before. And so it took 5 years to pass that, but it started his personal journey of his studio getting shut down. And he took this fight on for all the other people also who were struggling to work from home in Nashville. And so I'm always reminded of people's journey lead them to places they never thought they would be the fighter or champion for others, but their own story and their passion that is, behind it to make this change creates world-changing events for all of us. And so, and that leads me back again to you and to what inspired you to even become a writer? So I'm curious about that.
Well, Carrie, I practiced law for 42 years. I was a trial lawyer. We're kind of going out of style. I actually stood in front. I had over 100 jury trials in my career, so I stood in front of courts and juries. And you know what I did in that? I told stories. I don't mean fibs. I mean true stories about my client. I just love to share stories. I think one of the reasons. So many Southerners, I'm not trying to compare myself to the Eudora Weltys of the world and all that kind of stuff, but one of the reasons why we have so many good writers from the South is that we have a whole tradition of sitting and telling stories. I grew up sitting on the porch with my grandparents, shelling butter beans and hearing stories about my family. And so what I've done over the years is I have, when I've heard a story that's worth sharing, I've either done it in a short column, 500 words or so, or in a few times in a book. So that's I would like to flatter myself and call myself a writer, but I really think I'm a storyteller or a story sharer. That's what I like to do.
My mom was a great storyteller. So we have those also in Brooklyn. And she used to have these big dinner parties, and she would just tell stories, and people were riveted by the stories. And they were my family as well. I didn't even know this about my relatives. And so, I think the one thing I've learned, and I'm a people person, what I love is that everybody has a story. They don't think they do sometimes, but they truly do. If you start to ask, I mean, each person is a walking book in themselves. And so, and I have to say, really riveting as a storyteller. So I really appreciate you today.
I appreciate
sharing this.
Can I share with you a quote from Alex Haley, a great writer?
Sure, go for it.
A wonderful writer named Kill Hunt, and I think y'all know Kill. He's from Middle Tennessee boy, and fabulous columnist for the Tennessean, and the author of a wonderful book called A Coup. He wrote a beautiful book called Coup, which is about the de facto impeachment of Ray Blanton, and then wrote a recent book called Crossing the Aisle, which is about how bipartisan work has made so many great things happen in Tennessee. But in the introduction of that book, if I can quote Kill, who started off as an assistant to Senator Lamar Alexander, he said that Senator Alexander, who was very close to Alex Haley was with him one time when the senator was going to make a speech. And before they was going to make the speech, Senator Alexander asked, he said, "Alex, do you have any advice for me?" And Alex said, "Yeah, Lamar, don't make a speech. Go tell them a story." That's what people want to hear. And I've found as a trial lawyer that people, I hope, were moved by stories, not all the time. I wasn't Perry Mason. I didn't win all the time. But I think people want to hear the story. And that's why I love telling the story of Joe Hanover.
Well, when you were telling about him and how he did get it passed, he told his own story. You were saying,
yeah, he did.
At the very end, he basically told his story, and that's what changed people's minds. So there you have it.
That is an excellent point. That his final speech was to tell a story about why he was there and why winning the vote for his mother and for Harry Burns' mother and for women of America, why that was so important to him as part of the story. That's an excellent point. So
I have to say, I try in these talks, because our Gordon JCC Center is a center for all people, and so it's not a place of bringing politics in a way that would, to just bring that in. We try to stay in this territory for everybody's welcome, and we don't get into that whole area, which can be very divisive, especially these days. I do have to say that when you would talk, even the title of this book, I can't help but think of, like, in the news lately, the wall of moms, and so it's just like, moms, here they are, watch out. And so it just brought that to mind. And it's like everything these days, I feel like it's a lot of eggshell walking in, because of the divisiveness, and yet all these conversations are so important. I did want to ask you if you would let people know where they can buy your book.
Well,
and if you could please hold it up so you can see the whole thing, because before, hold it up. Yeah, there we go. And then please let us know where we can buy your book, and if people want a signed copy. Talk about that for a minute so everybody can learn more.
Sure. Well, I don't know if they still have copies, but Tom Vikstrom, my friend over at the Hermitage Hotel, they were selling it in the books, the gift shop at the Hermitage Hotel. Tom, if you're watching, if you need some more copies, I hope you need more copies. It is available, of course, on Amazon.com. Let me give you Hillman Publishers in Jackson, Tennessee. Jackie Hillman. It's phenomenal what they did. If you go on my website, the Hillman Group, excuse me. If you go on my website, hard to remember this, www.billhaltom.com. Okay, I worked long and hard. I paid advisors to come up with that. BillHaltom.com. You can order the book there, and if you actually, when you order the book, if you just want to send me a note along with that, I'll be happy to sign you a copy. I tell people I'm no John Grisham. My books are available online. They're available on Amazon.com. They're available on my website, and they're available in the trunk of my car. And of course, it's kind of hard to make those deliveries these days. But I tell people sometimes, if you want me to bring you by some books, please do that. You'll help me get better mileage to get them out of the trunk of my car. But
and also thank you for that. And I know that many people now, especially after today, will want to learn more. So, well, I don't know that, but I'm hoping that, because, this was just such an incredibly inspiring start to the, what you told was like, to want to jump in more and learn. What are other books? Just please let us know, what other books did you write as well? Just if you don't mind mentioning them.
I've written 8. It's eclectic, to say the least. There's no pattern to this. I wrote a couple of books about my experiences as a lawyer. I wrote a book called In Search of Hamilton Berger: The Trials and Tribulations of a Southern Lawyer. Hamilton Berger was the ill-fated prosecutor on the Perry Mason show who Perry beat every week. And so I wrote a tribute to him because the more I practice law, the more I begin to admire Hamilton Berger for his perseverance. I wrote a biography of Senator Howard Baker, who I miss a great deal, who I did get to know because he was still alive when I was writing the book. And the title of that book, I love the title, it's called The Other Fellow May Be Right: The Civility of Howard Baker.
That is a great title. And that's just a great thing to keep in mind when speaking with anybody, I've learned.
That's right,
Carrie. You may be right.
Yeah, he had a little mantra. He said, "I'm a Republican. I'm a conservative. I believe in basic conservative principles. I believe in limited government." He said, "But when I was a boy, my father used to always say, Howard, always remember the other fellow may be right."
I love that. You
have to listen. And I tell in the book the story of many times that he worked in a bipartisan. He helped Jimmy Carter pass the Panama Canal Treaty in 1977, which some people believe really hurt him when he ran for president in 1980. The charge that he, quote, helped Jimmy Carter, quote, give away the Panama Canal. And many other things he did over the years. And of course, he was very close to many Democrats. He and John Siegenthaler were very, very close. Another great man, and John Siegenthaler.
He spoke many times at the Gordon JCC. We used to have him. He spoke several times on Martin Luther King Day. He would come and speak to our members.
A real hero.
Amazing. Very unforgettable. Mm-hmm.
In 1966, one quick story about John Siegenthaler and Howard Baker. In 1966, when Howard Baker made his second run for the United States Senate, ran against the legendary Frank Clement, Governor Frank Clement of Tennessee. And John Siegenthaler was the young editor of the Tennessean, and he made the decision for the Tennessean to endorse Howard Baker over Frank Clement. Now, that doesn't sound like much now. The Tennessean had never endorsed a Republican in its entire existence. And and he made the decision there, even though he was a liberal Democrat who later pushed Al Gore to run for Congress and run for president of the United States, and was Bobby Kennedy's assistant. So it's a great story. And one other book I'll just have to mention, because I'm wearing it, and you're a fashion designer, Carrie, is I wrote the quintessential book on seersucker, Milk and Sugar, the complete book of seersucker. And the reason I can say confidently it's the quintessential book on seersucker is, to my knowledge, it's the only book that's been written about the iconic fabric that Atticus Finch made famous, that is still today in the post-air conditioning age, still worn by well-dressed men and women everywhere.
And to that note, Nashville has an ever-growing fashion industry happening, and they have Nashville Fashion Week is coming up. So I don't know if you were aware of that, but there's a big, there's an ever-growing, business to Nashville fashion, and it's becoming pretty strong. And so I think they might like to know about your book. So we're gonna have to make connections there.
Help spread the word, Carrie.
So on that note, because we're coming to the end of our time together, I want to thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing from our members, because as soon as I usually end these, I get these emails like, great program, and how do I contact him? And so I'm looking forward to anybody who might want to get connected with you to please write me if you have to, or just go right to your website. And I would love to have you back, because really riveting storytelling, so informative, intellectually stimulating, and so appreciative of your time today that you took to be with us.
Well, thank you. I just love to share stories with you. And I want to thank again the support, Alex Heller, who contacted me, and Gene Roseman, I just can't thank all of you so much. My only regret is I can't be actually with you face to face. But one of these days, this will be over. Pandemic will be over, and we will do it then.
We are totally going to have you when that happens. You're going to be first on that list. So we'll be in touch.
Thank you, Carrie.
Have a great day, and thanks again.